Hello, my name is Dave Lewis, and I am the host of Cinemallennials, the podcast where myself and another millennial watch a classic film for the very first time, ranging from the 1910s to the 1960s, and discuss its significance and relevance in the world today. On today's episode, I talked with my good friend Heather Reed, who picked 1931's Eine Stadt, zukt, einen, Morder, which was directed by Fritz Lang and was written alongside his wife, Thea von Harbou, who both worked together previously on his Dr. Mabuse series, the 5-hour-long Die Nibelungen Saga, and possibly the most influential science fiction film of all time. Sorry, Star Wars. Metropolis. Starring Hollywood icon before he was one, Peter Lorre, follows the story of Hans Beckert, a child murderer who is tracked down by both the German authorities and the criminal underworld. Is considered to be the first in the serial killer slasher film genre, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
My name is Heather Reed. I was born in 1996. The first movie I saw in theaters was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Wow.
Yeah, my parents didn't really care about ratings. And then my favorite movie is The Departed.
Oh, okay, wow, very good choices. Wow, very young age to go see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. That's just like, wow. My first movies are Toy Story and Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. So have you seen any films from the 1930s prior to watching M?
No, I don't think I've seen anything this early.
Is there a reason why? Is there like an aversion to these types of films?
No, I really like classic films. I think I've just pretty much only seen things from like the 40s on, like some of the later Hitchcock films.
Right, of course. Yeah, you were the one that actually got me into Hitchcock with Vertigo and Rear Window. Who were your favorite actors from that period, besides Jimmy Stewart, obviously?
Jimmy Stewart. I also liked Clark Gable, Gone with the Wind.
Okay.
I feel like that was like one of my first like celebrity crushes, watching that as like a little kid.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's great. Did you know anything about the film prior at all?
No. When you sent me the list, I just started like looking through trailers and like reading a brief synopsis, and it stuck out to me just because I'm very into like serial killer, like true crime.
What draws you to those movies?
I don't know if it's like a fear. I'm very into like true crime podcasts, or maybe it's just like me being hyper vigilant. Like I always want to hear what's up, so I'm like better defense for it. But I really like thrillers. I like not knowing what's going to happen. So when I read that this was the first real like serial killer thriller, I was like, wow, I gotta know like where this came from.
Right. And did you see anything, like, did you know anything about Peter Lorre, who is the star of the film in this?
So he was in Casablanca, like
Yeah.
he had a smaller role in Casablanca, but that's pretty much the only thing that I think I've seen him in.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to bring that up too. Like, I feel like Casablanca is such a universally loved film. Like, I don't think I know anybody that has ever seen it that doesn't like that in some like way. And like the more I think about that movie, the more I want to watch it, the more like every year that I've seen it in theaters and stuff like that, and it's great. But he does, like, you're right, he does play a very small role in that film, like very early on. Greek. He is super influential, and actually this film is really it's his breakout role. So he goes from this film playing a child murderer, like super impassioned type of role, super intense. I mean, you can definitely tell by the end of the film how intense of an actor he is, especially with his like trademark big giant bulging eyes. Yeah. And it's funny, like you say that, like, and we both say that that's how we know him of him. But we probably, did you watch Looney Tunes as a kid?
I did, yeah.
Okay, so you and I, like, since Looney Tunes isn't like really a thing, like now, like it's not on TV, but it's gonna be on HBO Max soon, which is really interesting. It's interesting to see like how younger generations react to that. They might know them from Space Jam, but it's interesting to see because he is in actually a lot of the jokes in Looney Tunes. Like,
Really?
they make fun of Peter Lorre so much. If you go back and look at like Peter Lorre Looney Tunes on YouTube, there's so many gags about him. It's insane. He's super influential throughout the 30s and 40s and even a little bit in the 50s. But this is his first big role. And a little bit on Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang actually was approached by Goebbels to say one of his Goebbels was, if people don't know, he was like the big time propaganda minister for the Nazis in the Third Reich. And he approached Fritz Lang because Fritz Lang was a massively influential director at this time. Like, people still think that he's one of the greatest directors in general of all time, with the way that he is so influentially recognized today in a lot of films, like particularly with Metropolis. Like I said before, people think that film is like the greatest film of all time, let alone the greatest science fiction film of all time. How did you feel about this movie? Like,
I loved it. I thought it was great. Definitely different when I think about a serial killer film, like a modern day serial killer film. They're normally very graphic and they focus more on the villain rather than like the efforts of like the police force. But it was interesting to see the differences. There were a lot of things that I saw that I think have influenced like horror and serial killer films modern day. But the ending definitely got to me. I think that really brought everything together and like made the whole experience worth it.
Could you see the influences that a lot of serial killer films use today from this film?
Yeah. Like at the beginning of the film, I made note they were doing like a nursery rhyme, and it was about like the child serial killer, and that made me think of like the 1-2 Freddy's Coming for You, like from Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right.
And I was like, I wonder if that's why, because I feel like every good like horror movie or serial killer movie always has like a creepy nursery rhyme that some kid is singing. So I thought that was definitely very telling. And then the thing about the balloons too, like the blind guy selling the balloons, and like when the girl goes missing, like her balloon floats up and gets caught in the like power lines. That reminded me of It. So I definitely saw there were like stylistic choices that I think were like so critical to the film that they've become like staples of that genre.
Yeah, there's like a big time trope. Like, it's funny that you're saying all this. Like, I myself, like, you know this, I'm not a great fan of like horror films and stuff like that. I'm the biggest scaredy cat in the world when it comes to horror films. So these things are so iconic about the different nursery rhymes, Ring Around a Rosie and stuff like that. We all fall down and like all these terrible things. You see it in every trailer now, where it's like if it's anything set in the past, there's always like, whether it be the witch or like things like that, it just, they have to have this kind of creepy child beginning of the film or in the trailers. And it's such a weird, I guess it's like, I was listening to another podcast and they were trying to say the whole like mystical kind of thing with children is that you're not thinking about death. You're not thinking about this horrible thing that happens, turn into a playful type of attitude. And it's really interesting to see that within this film and how, I mean, clearly you can see it within all these other films after it, maybe whether it be on purpose or maybe it's just parallel thinking. But I think that it's really interesting what he does here with a lot of the shots itself. Like a lot of the shots, I felt like they were very like reminiscent of the 1960s or 70s. Like some Hitchcock probably took a lot of his stuff from this as well. Do you think that?
Yeah, I do, definitely. Just like the way like the camera would pan in, and there were just a lot of really odd angles. Like I remember when I think it was like Lerman, the like investigator, that like upward shot like underneath the table.
Yeah,
that
Lerman,
definitely seemed like very reminiscent of Hitchcock, like the way that he filmed scenes. And then just some of like the really, really zoomed out, like watching the people on the streets. Yeah, definitely. I think he took a lot of his style from there.
The thing that the shot that I immediately like thought of was the shot where it's in the middle of Elsie's mother like calling to her, which, oh my God, that scene broke my heart. You know he's on the prowl. It's so heartbreaking to see the mother like constantly calling for her. And within that call, she is getting increasingly worried, and you hear that in her voice. And the shot that I thought was so Hitchcockian, proto-Hitchcockian, was the image of the stairs.
Yeah.
Do you remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, it's very reminiscent of Vertigo, where it has the dolly zoom, or the Zolly, where it goes in and out, like that really kind of quick motion, or not quick, but like the focusing of it in and out and in and out. What did you think about the leitmotif in there? The da-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na.
It kind of seemed like his tell. It almost seemed like when I reached the end of the movie and he said that he couldn't help what he was doing,
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like a compulsive behavior, that maybe he wasn't even aware that he was whistling, because that seemed like when he was in like killer mode,
Mm-hmm.
like that just sort of came out.
Right. Is so intense and so fast, like all the time. I think it's really interesting that Long and his wife chose that song to convey his thoughts, like the running of his thoughts constantly, like he's not himself. He's like
Right.
in his head is just like constantly running, and then he's like so impassioned by it that it takes over his whole body, and he does, like he says in the end, he doesn't remember anything after he does it. Like he doesn't
Right.
remember himself doing it at all. And I thought that was brilliant. Like, and it's also, this is the first use of that, of the leitmotif, which is a common theme. I think I'm getting this right. Common theme of music that goes in and out throughout the film or throughout the show that it's in. And I think, like I said, I think it's just so brilliant that they chose that song, because you feel that suspense. Like right now, the big popular thing that I'm noticing with suspense films, and a good example would be Dunkirk, is the constant ticking of a
Like the
mechanical
ticking of the
watch,
clock, yeah.
right? So it's
Mhm.
really interesting to see how you go from a piece of classical music to like clocks and watches and things ticking like that, to have these kind of noises and sounds to build that suspense inside you and to feel what the characters are feeling, right?
Yeah. Well, especially in
So
like old
no, you're going.
movies when there's ordinarily no sound, like they don't have background music like most modern movies do. So
Right.
whenever that came into the film, I felt like the whole tone of the scene just shifted
Yeah.
immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I felt. I was like, oh, okay, now we know what's happening. Now we're on a ride. Here's where we're going to go next. We don't actually know where we're going to go next, but we know that it's not a good place. What did you think about the end? Like, is it interesting that we see that kind of perspective from the defense, where he's talking about this man is clearly mentally ill and we need to give him up to the state so the state can help him and protect him and, protect others from him. What did you think about that compared to what films react to that kind of idea today?
Well, so I don't even think it's just like a film issue today. I think it's like a societal issue. Like as more and more research has come out about, like they're doing brain scans on like all of the different serial killers, and they're finding that there are like similarities in like the amygdala is enlarged in like all of the major serial killers, or like certain areas of their brains work more than others. Um, I felt like it was, to me, it's like an interesting argument, like the culpability that somebody has. Is it his fault? And do we excuse evil actions because of like an issue with like nature versus nurture?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen, I guess, a lot of movies handle that in modern day. It generally seems like when there's like serial killer films, they just focus on like this evil person. They kind of demonize the serial killer. They don't really, I think, show that side of their being, that like, hey, I can't control this isn't me, like this isn't what I want to do. And I definitely think that happens. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like the insanity plea is hard because there's not a lot of justice for the family. Like the moms in that situation, like in the room when they were deciding whether or not they were going to kill him, the moms are like, well, we need justice.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the end, when they're in the courtrooms and that lady said, like, well, killing him isn't going to bring our children back. We all need to take better care of them, you know.
That's what I thought was really interesting, that they posed this really extremely difficult question. And on top of that, so what Heather was just talking about was, in the film, it's the underground criminals versus the actual law. And the underground criminals basically come up with this idea to use homeless people as like a kind of brigade, and they're patrolling each street in order to see who is the actual killer. And they eventually trap him and bring him into this kind of shady basement and put on their own trial, almost like a kangaroo court where the criminals are trialing this criminal. And what Heather said before was there were women within that court saying that you have to think about the mothers. They can't ever have their children back. They'll never, understand why or how or whatever. And if these criminals were saying, kill him, kill him, kill him. But isn't the whole thing of justice, or to a certain extent, or to certain people, not to quote unquote stoop as low as to the level of those people that committed that crime? And it's just interesting to see them, and a lot about this film, throughout the film, when even at the beginning of the film, we see a lot of stuff that's happening today within people's public opinions and people's private opinion. I think the main thing was when the story of the murder of Elsie's murder, the first girl that's murdered in the movie, when you see that, now people are trying to accuse each other of, oh, no, you're the murderer. No, you're the murderer. I'm going to sue you for saying like all this other stuff. It's just so reminiscent of what is happening today.
It does seem like everybody was playing the blame game, which, I mean, is what happens a lot today, with the media, not specifically with like serial killers, but with like any hot button issue, even the way that people are handling like COVID response, Republicans are blaming the Democrats are blaming the Republicans,
right.
CDC is blaming whoever. Yeah, it did seem like everybody, instead of trying to find justice for this girl, immediately jumped to like, well, it wasn't me. It was like self-protection first, and then like altruism and caring about others later. Yeah, I think it definitely had a commentary just on the narcissism in our society, which I think is still very.
Oh yeah, completely. Like I was just so like, whenever I watched this movie like last year, and I was just like thinking about it again. Just it's interesting to see, especially from like you just said, the whole COVID kind of what is going on right now, and how people are relating things in general to a lot of different cultural touchstones. And I think if more people understood, or more people watched this film, they would understand what's really going on, or what's, how people can relate to other people and empathize with them to a certain degree. Yes, understandably, it's very hard to empathize with a murderer at the end of this film, or just in general. But when you see how impassioned and how like painful it is for him to feel these feelings at the end of the film, it's so shocking to see. And then on top of that, with the way that how people accuse each other throughout the film, and it's just like, oh no, you're doing this, no, I'm not doing this, like blah blah, and they're like targeting like old poor people and like old men and stuff like that, saying like, oh no, you're the horrible person. It's so interesting to see the whole tribalism and how exactly that is still going on today. And I mean, this film was almost made close to 100 years ago now, in the next couple of years. So it's just really interesting to see how, films all the way back in the 1930s, the 1920s, the 1910s are still relevant to today's society, and how we still don't learn from the past, even though we know about the past, especially like learning about COVID-19 and the flu outbreak of 1918, 1919. It's really interesting to see how we've progressed as a human race through, history and the history of film.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that there are vices within like human nature that time just can't correct. People are always looking for self-preservation, and I think, yeah, and the movie shows that it's hard for people to see beyond like their own scope, which I think is relevant today, where people think they're invincible to COVID and they're going out, they're not following the protocol because they're like, oh, it doesn't affect me. Whereas like everyone in the movie, yeah, was trying to get the blame off themselves. And meanwhile, they were losing precious time, like finding the murderer.
What were the things that were most striking to you about this film, besides the themes, besides, the shots and stuff like that? Like, how are the performances for you?
The performances, the character that really stuck out to me was the leader of the band of criminals who was trying to condemn the murderer to death. I found that to be very interesting because I think that's something that's very true nowadays too. Criminals hate people who do things to kids.
Yeah.
They didn't go into detail about what exactly he did to the kids. They just said he was a murderer. But like if you look in the prison system, like child molesters and like child serial killers, people who abuse children, generally most criminals can all agree upon that that's just like universally wrong. So to see that character who like banded everybody together and was like, no, we're going to take this guy out. To me, it was very striking to see justice existing within a community that I would say is like generally unjust and kind of like lawless justice. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, they were trying to, like, when I first saw the film, I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, I liked how they were doing that and how, as you said, these people hate like child murderers. And like the one line was like, I know all these terrible crooks, and they're like, it was the lady at the bar when they were arresting all these criminals, trying to figure out who it was and if they knew anything. She was like, I know all these very hardened criminals, and they weep when they see these like kids like being reunited with their mothers and stuff like that. It's just really interesting to see, like, yeah, they're like, and it's again the whole, I think the whole underlining theme of this film is people are human and they have different and complex emotions. And there are people that have, physical and mental illnesses where we have to kind of empathize with them and see how we can help them in order for them to stop hurting society, to grow as people, you know?
Yeah.
And so when you say about, because I find that character massively interesting as well. And at the end, when the drunken like defense lawyer says, yeah, but you're on 5 accounts, so why can you commend this man to death? And I mean, come on, you're also a big time murderer yourself. So just because he's killing kids doesn't mean he shouldn't, he's not as bad as you are or whatever, stuff like that. And I think that's like really interesting to see. And it's very hard to see this kind of thing where people are being, it's almost society is being put on trial.
Like he who's without sin cast the first
Yes, thank
stone.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that kind of shows, not that I think that like the child murderer was more deserving of death than that person, because obviously we don't know like who the 5 people were. Yeah. But I do think that it shows that our justice system, justice of any kind, has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, and it has to be looked at with like added scrutiny, because not all homicide is equal. And I think that from their perspective, they recognized that yes, they are criminals, and yes, they do things that are wrong, but they were not causing harm to an innocent part of society, whereas like he was posing a threat to an innocent part of society that didn't deserve it.
Yeah, and they couldn't defend themselves either.
Yeah, exactly. A friend of a friend just published a book about like people on death row.
Right.
And she is like a teacher, and she was like teaching writing in like the death row prison system in North Carolina. And just the way that we treat criminals and the way that they determine who gets on death row and who like doesn't, to me it's like it kind of similar to this situation, because it's like, can we rehabilitate the person? Like obviously in the movie, this murderer, he was like, I can't control this, and the defense attorney's like, we need to turn him over to the state can help him, the state can rehabilitate him. It's like, is the purpose of justice retribution or is it rehabilitation?
Right.
Which I've found myself very conflicted, because I've been in this book club for this book, and they've been having like the death row inmates who helped write this book call into the book club, and we've been talking to them, and most of them do feel a lot of remorse for what they did, and despite the heinous nature of their crimes, like since getting into prison have tried to like come back from that and have tried to do better, be better, atone, like make things right with the families of the victims.
Right.
And a lot of times, like for death row, like the death penalty, it's not necessarily determined based on the crime itself. It's whether or not the prosecution wants to bring that forward as like the intended charge. So yeah, it just, to me, there was a lot of parallels between this and then like this other facet of my life that I've been like focusing on with this book club, just seeing like, what is justice? Like, what do we consider justice, and like what should justice be focused on?
Why do you think millennials should watch this film?
I think that it would be important for people to watch this film, millennials specifically, just because I think millennials are very caught up in that like self-involvement and like putting themselves first and not looking at things from other people's perspective. I think that our generation is not very empathetic just in general, because we see things through this clouded lens, like, oh, we're invincible. And I think having access to social media makes everybody very like entitled and just people feeling larger than life. So, I mean, I think from the perspective, like the ending of the movie, where you really see that, he's not this like malicious monster that everyone thought. He's just this broken man who has no idea why he's doing what he's doing. And like getting to see it from that other perspective, I think is like a pretty good lesson, not just with like killers specifically, but I mean, in any situation, taking you outside of your own point of view and outside of your own beliefs and looking at a situation holistically, which I think is really hard for people our age to do. So I think it would be beneficial for millennials for that. And because it was a good movie.
Besides it being like a great film and a very suspenseful film, like the whole time, like when they're in that building trying to catch him, I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? Like, are they going to catch him? But yeah, like I completely agree with what you just said. We live in a society today, especially millennials, where, we put ourselves out there to a certain extent, where it's people talk about brands all the time now. And how people, especially our age, I mean, I'm the last person to talk because I put so much like dumb stuff on Instagram and things like that about, the different things that I'm involved in. And everybody does that now. Everybody does that to a certain extent. And to see how people are so involved within their own bubbles in the big extreme cases. And when you look at the art of filmmaking, is basically looking at what is our society today and how we are able to put a lens up to that within a bigger context and a bigger extravagance, like making it bigger than it actually is in order to actually show and to say, hey, this is what we're doing right now. Probably not the thing we should be doing. It's a kind of like, it's an investigation within an investigation with this film. It's why do we do this to society? Why do we do this to the mentally ill? Why do we do this to criminals? Like, why do we do this in general? And it's trying to offer up a answer. It might not be the right answer. It might not be the wrong answer, but an answer to something. And that's what I think people don't understand a lot about film. They just think, oh, it's a movie. Let's just watch it, enjoy it for the time being, for that limited time. But when you look at this stuff, I mean, like you said, we live in a society right now, especially the millennial society as a whole, where we see ourselves within this bubble, within this world where we think, oh, we're invincible. COVID's not going to affect me. It's not going to help, like, whatever. People are actually like kind of using their stuff with COVID to say, let me build myself up even more here,
Right.
And it's often interesting to see like how these people are trying to push themselves to what they're actually not and what they try to hide within themselves. And then sometimes those things are put on a higher stage without them even knowing it. And then they have to apologize later because they're like, oh, I didn't mean it like that. I didn't mean like that.
That's so true. I mean, every time you turn around, someone's apologizing for making an insensitive comment. And I do think that like social media just is a breeding ground for these sort of like extreme beliefs, and like it is just like a platform for people to say things that are offensive and to make ignorant remarks. So
Exactly.
I agree with what you're saying.
Like we don't see, and I mean, like we said before, in this film, we see all of that. We see all of that with like people accusing each other. We see people, saying, oh, you said this, but it's this. And then, when they're confronted with that, they don't know how to respond. So they immediately say, go on the offensive, and they apologize. Or, even though maybe sometimes they didn't do the wrong thing, or sometimes they didn't do the right thing. And it's like people have these whole kind of like, oh, let's get our pitchforks and like, torches out and like get everybody out, just drag them out, without actually thinking about the human condition. And that's what I think a lot of people need to learn, is to empathize and to see people for who they are, and to realize, like, to look inward and say, hey, he's suffering through this. Maybe we can help him instead of condemning him. Please plug that book.
It's called Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row, and the main author is Tessie Castillo. So you can find it on Amazon, and you can also, she has a website, you could sign up for her book club. But really fascinating to look at just how we treat death row inmates and some of the reasons why they got to that place and like where they can come back from. Super great read, very emotional. I felt a certain way about the death penalty before and about the justice system before, and now after reading it and after going to this book club, I feel completely differently.
I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion I had with Heather about Fritz Lang's magnum opus, M. I really enjoyed our discussion and want to say thank you to her for agreeing to it so enthusiastically. If you enjoyed this episode of Cinemallennials and want to watch the film we discussed, please check out my website, dlumoviereview.com, for more episodes of the podcast, film reviews, analyses, and where to purchase the film we discussed today. Please don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating. Thank you.